Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's commemoration, and the theme is the liberation from Auschwitz 75 years on. Before I start, could you please turn your mobile phones to silent? My name is Sue Hampel, and I'm co-president of the Jewish Holocaust Centre. It is a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of my co-president, Pauline Rockman, our director, Jayne Josem, and our board, and on behalf of Jennifer Huppert, President of the Jewish Community Council of Victoria, and her board. Both organisations undertake to hold the Melbourne-based annual United Nations Holocaust Remembrance Day. I also wish to acknowledge the Boon Wurrung and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose land we stand, and to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. In addition to our keynote speakers, Holocaust survivor Mrs. Eva Slonim, OAM, and Professor Jeffrey Rosenfeld, AC, OBE, and our wonderful Holocaust survivors, we are privileged this evening to welcome representatives of groups and organisations from a broad cross-section of our community. Mr. Michael Pearce, Honorary Consul General of the Federal Republic of Germany, Mrs. Hetty Goldberg, Honorary Consul of the Republic of Botswana, Consul General of Greece, Mr. Dimitros Michalopoulos. I'm pleased to recognise the presence of Josh Burns, Federal Minister for McNamara, Paul Hamer, State Member for Box Hill, Nina Taylor, Member of the Legislative Council Victoria, Juliana Addison, Member for Wendouree, David Southwick, State Member for Caulfield, Clifford Hayes, Member for the Legislative Council Victoria, Kieran Chestnut, representing the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade from Canberra, Vivian Nguyen, Chair of the Victorian Multicultural Commission, Walter Rappaport, Victorian Multicultural Commission Councillor. The City of Glen Eira is represented this evening by Mayor Margaret Ezakoff and Councillor Jamie Hymans. I also welcome Mrs. Nina Bassett, immediate past President of the JCCV, Dr. Margaret Klatt, President of the Australian Institute of Polish Affairs, and representatives of many, many community groups and organisations from Victoria's multicultural and multi-faith communities. I'd also like to welcome the Australian delegates of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, Donna Lee Fries, Andre Obler, and of course Pauline Rockman. Thank you everybody, I hope I haven't left anyone out, but thank you everybody for attending this very special commemoration. 75 years ago today, Soviet forces liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest Nazi killing centre in occupied Europe. The world was in shock when the most horrible act in the history of mankind became known. Stunned Soviet troops confronted unspeakable conditions and discovered over 6,000 emaciated prisoners barely alive when they entered the camp. Among the prisoners were 200 children, including 13-year-old Eva Slonim and her 10-year-old sister Marta. Later this evening, we will hear Eva's testimony from that day of liberation. Commemoration events marking the 75th anniversary of the liberation of German Nazi concentration and extermination camps and other sites of persecution and murder are taking place all over the globe, from Brussels, where representatives of 35 nations, including Australia, renewed their commitment to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance to work together to counter Holocaust denial and distortion, anti-Semitism, and all forms of racism and discrimination that undermine fundamental democratic principles. At Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, more than 40 kings, presidents, prime ministers, including Russian President Vladimir Putin, French President Emmanuel Macron, German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, US Vice President Mike Pence, the Prince of Wales, and Australia's Governor-General David Hurley, declared that anti-Semitism has no place in our global society. Remembering the past is a duty for all humankind, a responsibility to future generations, and never again must become a renewed clarion cry for humanity. Our Prime Minister, the Honourable Scott Morrison, also reflected these views in his statement today for Holocaust Remembrance Day. As a member of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, he wrote, "We affirm Australia's strong commitment to uphold the memory and enduring lessons for this vile chapter in the history of mankind." In Auschwitz, today, over 120 Holocaust survivors, including Sydney survivor Yvonne Engelman, will gather to remember the greatest evil ever perpetrated against man in the long catalogue of human crimes, and she will take part in the main commemoration service. And yet, 75 years after the Holocaust, hatred and intolerance still lurk in the human heart. Anti-Semitism and racism is on the increase, and Australia is not immune. At the Jewish Holocaust Centre, we dedicate ourselves to teaching the dangers of apathy, prejudice, bigotry and hatred as central to our primary mission. Our survivors are educating over 23,000 Victorian school students to commit to a world that remembers the Holocaust and a world without genocide. Never again is now. Now is the time to fight back, and we must all work together to combat anti-Semitism. We must not allow history to repeat itself. So today, the 27th of January, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, is an opportune time to reassert our commitment to human rights, to go beyond remembrance and make sure succeeding generations apply the lessons of the Holocaust to bring peace and harmony to all mankind. As stated this morning in a press release by the Honourable Maurice Payne, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Women, today we mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day, commemorating the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, and through 2020, the anniversary of the end of the Holocaust. We honour the victims and survivors of the Holocaust and pledge to keep their legacy alive, along with our earnest efforts to ensure genocide never returns. It is important for all of humanity that such an appalling chapter in human history continues to be remembered today and by future generations. Almost 27,000 Holocaust survivors settled in Australia after World War II, making Australia one of the most favoured destinations for survivors after Israel itself. They and their families found a safe home in Australia, and we are determined to keep it that way. Australia was proud to gain full membership of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in June 2019, and we will share through that forum our approach to Holocaust remembrance, education and research, including our efforts to counter the spread of online Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is one of the most insidious forms of gross human rights abuse. Defeating it is integral to Australia's human rights agenda. I'm delighted to introduce my friend, Holocaust survivor, Eva Slonim. She is a remarkable and inspiring woman. Eva is a testament to the human capacity for the preservation of morality under the most extreme circumstances. From Eva, and indeed from many of our survivors here tonight, we can see the resilience and power of the human spirit. Eva has never wavered in her commitment to educate about the Holocaust and keep alive the memory of those who perished. Eva, can you please come and deliver your testimony?
Ladies and gentlemen, survivors and friends, tonight is the United Nations International Holocaust Memorial Day, 75 years after the liberation of Auschwitz. We survivors keep the memory alive every day of our lives, in our daily activities, in our sleep and slumber. For us survivors, it has been 75 years of coping, of reliving, of asking why, and why, finally, why me? Why did I survive? Riddled with guilt that I face every day. My dear friends, I stand here tonight knowing that it is incumbent on me, as one of the last witnesses to the Holocaust, to recount, to document, to bear witness, to perpetuate every facet of the greatest loss, suffering, and tragedy that befell the Jewish people. To this end, I want to express my gratitude and give recognition to the Holocaust Center and its volunteers for their outstanding dedication in keeping the memory alive, and to the second and third generations for fulfilling the perpetuating, dying wish of men, women, and children who with their last breath whispered, "Tell the world," whilst others expiated with the word Kaddish. It was so important to them. Tell the world what others expiated with the word Kaddish. These holy skeletons on the threshold of death were concerned the effect this tragedy will have on future generations, knowing full well that they will not be part of that world. What generosity of spirit, what nobility. Sadly, there is a resurgence of anti-Semitism, as was just said, throughout Europe, as we have unfortunately witnessed in France, in Sweden, in Germany, England, Denmark, and even the USA. All this still in our lifetime. Still in our lifetime, revisionists are trying to rewrite history. In the documentary of the liberation of children in Auschwitz, in which I appear, the symbol of Jew was affixed on the left side of our specially given uniform. Jew was replaced with Polski by the Polish. What a distortion, what a lie, when Auschwitz unfortunately was primarily a Jewish tragedy, unprecedented in the annals of history. A sophisticated machinery set up for the sole purpose to annihilate in the most brutal and premeditated way the whole of European Jewry. My dear friends, allow me to share with you my experiences on the last days in Birkenau, prior to liberation 75 years ago. In the first days of January 1945, hard-pressed by the advancing Red Army, the SS hastily evacuated tens of thousands of Jewish prisoners under frightful conditions from Birkenau and Auschwitz to German labor camps. Their overriding principle and the cruel reality was that in spite of their imminent defeat, their foremost priority was that not a single man, woman, or child should live until liberation and tell the world of the inexhaustible fount of evil the supposedly most cultured people inflicted on its innocent and unsuspecting victims. The rapidity of the Red Army's advance forced the SS to leave their tasks unfinished, and that is how I survived. On the 18th of January 1945, the SS ordered the whole camp to be evacuated. Rumors were that whoever remained in camp would be killed. Even though I was sick, I ran away from hospital and presented for selection. I did not pass the test. My will to live was so strong that in the overwhelming chaos, I went together with my sister to the back of the line and presented again. This time, we passed the selection for the march which we believed would lead us to a path of freedom. I fought with all my might not to succumb, now when freedom was in my grasp, yet I was so very weak, plagued by unrelenting dysentery and typhus, that I finally surrendered and returned to camp, fully aware of the fate that was awaiting me. We were locked in the barracks by the SS behind the electrified barbed wire fences. They then set the hospital on fire and surrounding barracks as well. The fire rapidly advanced in our direction. Can you imagine? A heavy downpour of snow miraculously extinguished the fire. Well, we thought somebody still looking after us. These snowflakes, it was snowing, and these snowflakes were the neshamot, that's what I imagined, neshamot, the souls, descending from heaven to save us. We now realized that the Germans had left and that we were on our own. Those that were well enough and able raided the food and clothes storages. Many died of overeating. A few days later, to our horror, the SS returned. We were ordered once again at gunpoint to line up to take us with them as they retreated. We were ordered to march, walk, run to the whim of the SS. Those who faltered or could not keep up were shot. My emotions were numbed as we walked in deep, blood-drenched snow at -7 degrees from Birkenau towards Auschwitz. We reached Auschwitz, which was 3 kilometers away, and saw hand-to-hand fighting between the Russians, who wore white camouflaged clothes, and the Germans. Suddenly, the fighting stopped. The Russians ordered the SS to line up and told us that we could do whatever we liked with them. You should have seen those big heroes, those that had no heart for us children, who were killing in cold blood, were now begging for mercy. Trembling with fear, those same soldiers who had no pity on us children begged us, as I've just said, that for mercy. Those cowards, no one touched them. So the war for us children was over. The adults and we children had managed to stay alive through hiding, humiliation, torture, depravity. Overwhelmed and speechless as we were, as were our liberators, obviously for different reasons. The freedom we had anticipated, for which we struggled so hard, was an illusion. Face to face with liberty, we felt lost, emptied, and perplexed. No one waited for us children. No parents, no brothers, sisters, grandparents. There were no celebrations. Instead, after medical examination, I was hospitalized. I was given blood transfusions and other treatment. I was back in bunks, surrounded by authority and uniform. The conditions in hospital were appalling. Patients were screaming, dying all over the place. Some violently, others resigned, too weak to protest. There was one Jewish prisoner from Bratislava, where I come from, a Mr. Franco, who refused his bread portion as he claimed that it was Pesach. Shortly after some matzot reached Auschwitz, I grabbed a little piece of what I thought was matzah, and with great excitement ran as fast as I could, actually not as fast, to Mr. Franco. I was too late for Mr. Franco. He was cold and stiff, his eyes staring into the distance, no longer alive. In the children's barrack, we spoke every night of home, of food, of memories. Otherwise, we would not have survived. The torture we had to face the next day was horrific. We wrote a song in Hungarian, for most of the twins were from Hungary, to the tune of Hatikva. Loosely translated, it goes like this, with your permission. In this huge world of the camp, chased out of his barracks, the tired, sleepy, sluggish child, tears streaming down his face. Standing in the pouring rain, cold, shivering and drenched, for Zelapel, the unfortunate, stands hours in the cold. Be happy and rejoice, handsome Jewish worker. Soon all this will come to an end. The great day of liberation is approaching, and all the Jewish suffering will forever end. To our beautiful homes we will return, embrace our parents and all we have not seen for so long. Without that imagination, we couldn't have survived. There will be a table full of plenty at home, toys, dresses, dolls, sweets, and nothing will ever go wrong. Together once again we will stand tall as proud Jews and swear until death that we'll never deny that we are Jews. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva, for your heartfelt and searing testimony, which will be indelibly imprinted on our hearts and minds forever. I first heard Eva give her testimony in Auschwitz on Yom HaShoah, April 2004. And Eva, I know how difficult it was for you then and how extremely hard it was for you today to return to the place of your nightmares and give an eyewitness account of a 13-year-old girl who was in Auschwitz. Thank you so much for your bravery and for your courage. Thank you. Professor Jeffrey Rosenfeld, AC, OBE, has a deep understanding of the Holocaust, having experienced the aftermath of genocide in Rwanda, in which almost 1 million innocent people were murdered. He served as a military surgeon with the United Nations Assistance Mission in Rwanda in 1996. Jeffrey is a professor of surgery at Monash University and senior neurosurgeon at the Alfred Hospital. He is also a Major General in the Australian Defence Force and a former Surgeon General. Jeffrey has served on 8 deployments, including Iraq, East Timor, Bougainville, and the Solomon Islands. He is the Patron-in-Chief of the Victorian Association of Jewish Ex and Serving Men and Women, VAJEX, and we are very honoured to welcome the eminent Professor Rosenfeld to the podium to deliver his address.
Thank you, Sue. To Eva, Slonim, and all the survivors that are here and their families, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. As you've heard, on January the 27th, 1945, 75 years ago, the Russian soldiers entered Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp and liberated over 7,000 desperate, emaciated prisoners who had miraculously survived the Nazi terror. The Nazis had already forced the majority of Auschwitz prisoners to march westward in death marches. The construction of 4 large gas chambers and crematoria began in Birkenau in 1942. They went into operation between March and June of 1943. The Nazis set up thousands of concentration camps, from my reading. The Nazis distinguished slave labour and prison camps from extermination and death camps. They made the distinction themselves. The death camp's primary function was genocide. Auschwitz-Birkenau was a death camp which had the largest death count of all of the camps, with the deaths of over 1.1 million people. There have been massacres of people throughout history, but the murder of 6 million Jews was a deliberate, planned elimination of an entire group of people based on their religion, culture, and race, namely the Jews of Europe, where most Jews lived at that time. The industrial scale of this murder of innocent people was totally unprecedented in history. Other Nazi undesirables were murdered in the death camps as well. We shouldn't forget them, including gays, homosexuals, Soviet prisoners of war, political prisoners, and the Roma gypsies. The media describes concentration camps where the Chinese Uyghurs are in forced detention. These are so-called re-education facilities by the Chinese. They have no equivalence whatsoever to the Nazi concentration camps where Jews were enslaved for the Nazi war machine, and many more were murdered by gassing and then incinerating them. Let's put things into perspective. Well, why have I been given the honour of speaking to you? Unlike Eva Slonim, my father and his immediate family and my wife's family managed to avoid the Holocaust and get out of Poland before the worst happened, and they were able to eventually to migrate to Australia. But I am an eyewitness to the genocide and hatred that occurred in Rwanda in 1995, as you heard. I was deployed to Rwanda just after the genocide, in which upwards of 1 million innocent people were massacred and murdered. Murder and retribution was occurring whilst I was there. I was a military surgeon and member of the Australian contingent of the UN peacekeeping force, UNAMIR II, which eventually brought peace to that troubled nation. I treated many Rwandans, including men and women and children, with deliberately inflicted machete injuries in an attempt to murder them, and many others with landmine injuries. I have also deployed since to Iraq twice and witnessed the murderous acts of Al-Qaeda and ISIS fanatics. Why hasn't humankind learnt the lessons of the Holocaust? How could the genocides of Rwanda, Cambodia, Darfur and Bosnia have occurred after the horrors of Auschwitz and the Holocaust? I would like to consider the underpinnings of genocide and how we should prevent genocide from happening again. Racial differentiation and identification, envy, discrimination and irrational hatred is at the core. In Rwanda, the Hutus hated the Tutsis and rose up against them. This hatred had been going on for centuries, just as anti-Semitism had been going on for centuries in Europe. Anti-Semitism, the irrational hatred of Jews, was the fundamental basis for the Holocaust. The genocide was highly organised. The Jews were loyal citizens and were well integrated into German and European society, but that made no difference to the Nazis and their collaborators. The Nazis knew where all the Jews lived. The Jews were often given up to the Nazis by their neighbours and workmates, Christians. The Nazis kept detailed records concerning the Jews, who they were, where they lived, and who was sent to the concentration camps. The Hutu Rwandans who perpetrated the genocide against the Tutsis had lists of where all the Tutsis lived. You can see the commonalities. Dehumanisation of the victim is also a powerful precursor to genocide. The Nazis portrayed the Jews as rats and vermin to be exterminated. The Rwandans portrayed their victims as cockroaches to be stamped out. There is also irrational blame placed on the victims for deteriorating living standards and financial problems. Hitler and the Nazis scapegoated the Jews as the cause of all of Germany's economic woes at the time. In Rwanda, the Tutsis were the upper-class overlords and the Hutus were the workers who rose up against their masters. Somewhat different to Nazi Germany. Radio broadcasts were the trigger for the genocide in Rwanda. The Holocaust spread over a much longer period. Now, in the words of Primo Levi, monsters exist, but they are too few in number to be truly dangerous. More dangerous are the common men, the functionaries ready to believe and to act without asking questions. The human brain, which I know a fair bit about, has the built-in controls to avoid inflicting pain on others. The Nazi SS monsters were psychopaths who did not have these controls. They had no empathy and derived pleasure from hurting and witnessing the suffering of others. Hannah Arendt, that well-known author, characterised the Nazi functionary as the banality of evil. The banality of evil. In many cases, they were ordinary citizens doing the bidding of Himmler and Hitler, but not always. Adolf Eichmann was an ordinary functionary who helped to organise the genocide, but he was also a psychopath who hated the Jews with a passion. Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's deputy, chaired the infamous January 1942 Wannsee Conference on the final solution of the Jewish question. Of the 15 Nazis who attended, including Eichmann, amazingly 8 held academic doctorates. It only lasted 90 minutes, that planning session for the Holocaust, the genocide. They spoke about the logistics of genocide, and according to Eichmann, they also spoke about methods of killing and extermination. Normal SS business. How could Heydrich, a man who appreciated high art and culture and played Mozart and Beethoven on his violin, become such a vile monster, overseeing the organisation and execution of the genocide? Because he was a power-hungry psychopath who harboured an intense hatred of Jews. As a doctor, I must also mention the SS doctors, and Eva will know a lot about them, and Dr. Mengele. I shouldn't even call him a doctor. After World War II, the world learned the horrors of German doctors such as Joseph Mengele working in Auschwitz and other concentration camps. They helped select the Jews for execution, and they conducted horrific and deadly scientific experiments in which the subjects, particularly children and twins, had no say whatsoever. The Nuremberg Code was introduced in August 1947 after the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals, and this signalled the beginning of modern medical ethics. In these trials, Nazi doctors were convicted of the crimes committed during human experiments on concentration camp prisoners. The Nuremberg Code attempted to give clear rules about what was legal when conducting human experiments, and we follow them today. I would now like to address the very important issue of anti-Semitism. It is deeply concerning to me, and I'm sure all of you, that anti-Semitic incidents are increasing internationally and in Australia as well. The worst incidents are perpetrated by the white supremacist neo-Nazis and the Islamic extremists inspired by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Jews are attacked verbally, physically in the streets, in the synagogues, and in their homes. Nazi graffiti are increasingly appearing. Jewish graves are desecrated. A Nazi flag was recently flown with pride in a front garden in country Victoria. In my view, the public display of Nazi symbolism should be banned and illegal. A young Jewish boy was recently bullied and forced to prostrate himself before a Muslim boy and kiss the boy's feet. These horrific incidents are totally unacceptable. The perpetrators must be identified and brought to account or to justice. More insidious are the attempts to portray Hitler as a comedic, pathetic figure of ridicule, such as the German novel I'm Back and the recent film based on the novel Caging Skies. To me, this is an unacceptable recasting of history. Hitler's character should not be reimagined, recast, or placed in a more positive light. He will forever remain an evil monster. Fortunately, we live in Australia, where Australians are intolerant of racists and bigots. The more anti-Semitism there is, the stronger is the resolve of the Jewish people to defend themselves, and the stronger burns the flame of the Jewish faith. Never again is what we say every year, but how can we prevent a future Auschwitz? Indeed, how can we prevent anti-Semitism and racial hatred, which are precursors to genocide? And I'll give you 4 answers to that question. First, by remembering the unprecedented, despicable and depraved crimes perpetrated by Hitler, the SS and the Nazis. Indeed, by remembering the Holocaust and the 6 million Jews who were murdered by the Nazis. Second, by educating young people around the world, including Australia, about the Holocaust. And I congratulate the Holocaust Centre for doing just that. In 2017, believe it or not, 40% of 14-year-olds in Germany did not know what Auschwitz was. A 2018 survey found that 66% of American millennials and 41% of all US adults did not know what Auschwitz was. I wonder what the figures would be here in Australia, probably fairly similar. Just as children are taught the 3 R's, they should also be taught good citizenship. And I agree with Tanya Plibersek, who said that today as well, or yesterday. And about the need for tolerance and respect for all races, religions and creeds. Living in a multicultural society such as ours helps to inculcate a good community spirit in most children. Children also need to be taught what anti-Semitism actually means. As they get older, they also need to be taught what happens when civility breaks down and discrimination, envy and hatred become the guiding forces. This progresses to vandalism, then to physical violence, murder and on a mass scale, genocide, with the Holocaust as the centrepiece. Third, by always calling out anti-Semitism and racial hatred when it occurs. But it is ordinary citizens standing up against tyrants and calling out racism and bigotry when they see it who are the key to preventing genocide in the future, the ordinary citizen. Dr. Devere Abramovich, the chairman of the Anti-Defamation Commission, is a wonderful example of this. I also mention the Aboriginal gentleman William Cooper, who on behalf of the Australian Aborigines League at the time planned to meet the German consul in Melbourne to protest the cruel persecution of the Jewish people. He went there on the 6th of December 1938 and asked that his letter be conveyed to the German government. The delegation was refused entry. Alf Turner, Cooper's grandson, presented the consulate with a replica letter 79 years later, which did eventually reach the German government. It was one of the only protests in the world at the time, and it came from an Aboriginal man here in Melbourne. Fourth and finally, by having a committed police force and a strong legal framework to bring perpetrators to justice so that others are educated and hopefully deterred from repeating the same crimes. Although many key Nazi war criminals were brought to justice, others unfortunately escaped. An international criminal court and the International War Crimes Tribunal were set up so that the war criminals of the future can be tried, prosecuted and punished. Justice and deterrence are strong weapons we have to prevent future genocide. Hitler envisaged the Third Reich to be like a new Roman Empire in which he would rule the entire world. The German military was completely defeated by the Allies, including Australia and New Zealand forces. Hitler and Nazism were destroyed. The Third Reich turned to rubble, and the Jewish people survived and now thrive in Israel and the diaspora. May it be so forevermore. Let us remember the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust, those innocents who died in the gas chambers in Auschwitz and other death camps, those who were enslaved, worked and beaten to death, those who were tortured, those who were summarily shot, those subjected to sadistic medical experiments, and those women and their babies who were brutally murdered. Can you imagine a Nazi soldier throwing a baby against a wall to kill the child? It happened. On the brighter side, let us also celebrate those who survived, like Eva, eventually married and had large extended families. Many of these families thrived in Australia, as you know. It is of great historical importance that many of them recorded their experiences for posterity. I will finish with the words of Primo Levi. Auschwitz is outside of us, but it is all around us. It's in the air. The plague has died away, but the infection still lingers, and it would be foolish to deny it. Rejection of human solidarity, obtuse and cynical indifference to the suffering of others, abdication of the intellect and of moral sense to the principle of authority, and above all, at the root of everything, a sweeping tide of cowardice, a colossal cowardice which masks itself as warring virtue, love of country, and faith in an idea. We cannot allow the genocide to ever happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for your outstanding keynote address. We have a number of Rwandan survivors here tonight who I'm sure were very moved by your words. I particularly liked your discussion of the human brain. Do you think it can be reprogrammed for kindness and goodness rather than cruelty and evil? Your message is clear. We must learn from these dark chapters of human history and remain vigilant against discrimination whenever and wherever it occurs. And I agree with your points that remembrance, education, and calling out racism are vital, and that is the mission statement of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and our Jewish Holocaust Centre. So thank you very much for your keynote address. March of the Living is an organisation that is very close to my heart. For almost 20 years, Australian school students and adults have taken part in this life-changing program that takes participants to Poland to commemorate Yom HaShoah and to Israel to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut. I would like to welcome former participant Matan Franco to the stage, where he will perform a song, Rikma Anoshit.
If I may, I'd just like to say a few words before I start. Firstly, I would like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Bumwar and Wurundjeri people, and extend my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. It is a great honour for me to be here tonight. This song holds a special place in my heart. I was first asked to learn it and sing it as a student participant on the March of the Living program in 2009. At the time, I had just arrived to Melbourne. I didn't know many people, and as a somewhat shy 16-year-old, I felt the best way for me to communicate with others was through music, which is made all the more pertinent given the lyrics of this song, which you will see shortly, which describe how we are all an interconnected human thread and tapestry. And when we suffer the loss of even one life within that thread, the effects and ramifications are felt by us all. I had an incredible experience on the March of the Living program, which was made all the more special and meaningful by the incredible educators we had joining us at the time, Sue Hampel, Francis Prince, and Mark Baker, and by the presence and incredible stories and wisdom of the survivors who accompanied us on the trip, namely David Prince, Judy Colt, and Abraham Goldberg, whom I believe are all here this evening. The memories I have of the program are ones which I've carried with me almost 11 years later, and which now inform the work I do on a daily basis as the administrator for March of the Living Australia. Lastly, I think the words of the song are particularly pertinent on a more local scale, given the summer we are experiencing at the moment and the incredibly devastating loss of human life, wildlife, and nature that we've seen over the last few months.
מה שהוא ממך בי כולנו רקמה אנושית אחת חיה בין אחד מאיתנו הולך מימנו משהו
Thank you, Matan. That was absolutely superb and a wonderful, wonderful song that actually has become part of, it's almost like an anthem of March of the Living today. Thank you for singing it so superbly. Really wonderful. It is a tradition at Holocaust Remembrance services such as these to light 6 memorial candles to represent the 6 million Jews and millions of Roma and Sinti, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, mentally and physically handicapped and countless others and we also light these candles to remember victims of other genocides, from Cambodia and Rwanda to Bosnia and Darfur, Syria and Myanmar. So today, I'd like to call upon the 6 survivors and other members of the community to light the candles. So the first candle is Paul Grinwald. Paul was born in Paris in 1933. He was a young boy when the Germans occupied France and introduced anti-Semitic laws that excluded Jews from public life. From May 1941, Jewish men were being sent to the camps, and Paul's father managed to escape to unoccupied France. In July 1942, when the Nazis arrested all Jewish women and children, Paul, together with his mother and sister, was smuggled across the border and reunited with his father. 3 months later, the Germans occupied the whole of France. Paul and his sister were then placed on a farm where they worked for 12 months until funds ran out, and they joined their parents in hiding in an isolated hut in the countryside. After the Allied troops liberated France, the family moved back to Paris in May 1945, and they migrated to Australia in late 1946. Paul is a survivor guide at the Holocaust Centre. The second candle will be lit by a representative of the 3rd generation, Rebecca Forgasz. Rebecca is an Associate Professor of Community Engagement and Intercultural Communication at the ACJC, the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization, Monash University. She is responsible for leading the Centre's community engagement programs, developing new initiatives and partnerships across the community, professional bodies and creative industries. Previously, Rebecca was Director and CEO of the Jewish Museum of Australia, where she led a period of significant organisational development and creative revitalisation. Rebecca is the granddaughter of Irene Forgasz, a survivor of Auschwitz, and Ursula and the late Felix Flicker, both of whom survived the war with their families in Siberia. Ursula later became the inaugural archivist of the Jewish Holocaust Centre. Last year, motivated by the imperative not to be a bystander, a central message in Holocaust education, Rebecca co-founded the Jewish Climate Network to help raise awareness and inspire action in the Jewish community on the issue of climate change, a global crisis impacting the health, security and well-being of all humanity. Our third candle will be lit by representatives from other genocides, my good friend Frida Umuhoza from Rwanda. Frida is a survivor of the 1994 Rwandan genocide against the Tutsis. She was only 14 years old when her entire family was killed, and she was buried alive alongside 15 members of her family, only to be rescued by a young Hutu man who worked for her family. Now married to Rob van der Zaag, the couple has 7 children between them. Frida graduated from Bowling Green State University in the state of Ohio with a bachelor's degree of arts in communication. She speaks internationally and locally, and Frida has shared her story of a miraculous survival, God's grace, the power of forgiveness, inner healing and resilience. She has spoken in many countries, including Africa, Europe, America and Australia. She also speaks at high schools, universities, churches, organisations and women's groups. Frida also spoke at the United Nations in New York during the 2016 annual commemoration of the Rwanda genocide against the Tutsis. And the most recent time she spoke was at the Melbourne Holocaust Centre last year. Frida is also the author of a book, Frida, Chosen to Die but Destined to Live. Her passion is advocating for survivors and education on the issues of genocide prevention. Our fourth candle will be lit by Cheryl Plaut, Access. Since Cheryl moved to Melbourne from Sydney a couple of years ago, she has found community connection and personal and professional growth through her studies at Access Incorporated and her work in an accounting firm. Cheryl's dream is to be a working actress for an open and inclusive world. Cheryl is honoured to represent Access tonight and to light a candle in memory of all those whose dreams were cut short due to hatred, fear and misconception. Our fifth candle will be lit by Hinde Ina Bursti. Hinde is the daughter of Holocaust survivors from Warsaw and Białystok. Over 150 members of her family were murdered in the Holocaust. Hinde is the co-founder of the Jewish lesbian group of Victoria, the first LGBTIQ+ group in Victoria. She is a Yiddish lecturer, a teacher, a researcher, a writer, whose first international publication was in an anthology of Jewish lesbian daughters of Holocaust survivors. A passionate Yiddishist, feminist, social justice activist, and my friend, she believes that the best way to honour those murdered and the survivors is through maintaining the language Yiddish and through campaigning against prejudice, oppression, and injustice everywhere. She is honoured to light a candle tonight. For the last candle, I call upon Anita Kaminski. Anita is the daughter of one of the righteous among the nations, Gus Kaminski, who was a teenager in Holland during 1939 to 1945. She is the proud custodian of her mother's and grandparents' story of working with the Dutch underground to enable the rescue of Jewish people. This was achieved by Gus travelling by train from her home in the south of Holland to Amsterdam, a journey of approximately 4 hours one way. She would then take one person each trip back by train to hide in her parents' house, where they stayed before they could safely escape Holland through Belgium. Here tonight to also honour this important occasion are Gus's granddaughters Romy and Annika, as well as her great-granddaughter Layla. Their attendance at these occasions is of special importance to Anita, as they will be the future custodians of Gus's courageous story. Anita has been a volunteer of Courage to Care for many years, but not as active as she would like to due to work commitments. And in the last few years, she was a CEO of a dispute resolution body. And she looks forward to becoming a more active volunteer at Courage to Care over the next 12 months. So as we light these candles, let us remember all those people whose lives were taken away so cruelly in the Holocaust and in other genocides. And let these memories, let us plant seeds for a better future amid the soils of a bitter past.
Thank you, Sue. It's very hard to sort of reduce to a few words the impact of an evening such as this. But I'd like to start by thanking Eva Slonim, whose moving testimony showed her resilience and strength of spirit and reminded us in such a striking way the importance of remembrance. Remembering not only the individual victims of the Shoah, but the totality of what occurred and the lessons we must continue to learn for our own community, the broader society, about the dangers of hatred, racism, and what can result if they're unchecked. And she is a shining example to us, as all our survivors are, of what we, the human spirit, is capable of, but also the depth that it can sink to. And I thank you very much, Eva, for your contribution this evening. And also Professor Jeffrey Rosenfeld's powerful address examining the causes of genocide in view of his own experiences of genocide in Rwanda, and the lessons that we again learn about the role of irrational hate and dehumanisation. And I think we can all learn from the four examples, the four ways you gave us of combating and preventing anti-Semitism and genocide in the future. And I also want to thank our 6 candle lighters, Paul, Rebecca, Frida, Cheryl, Hinde, Ina and Anita. Again, you represent by lighting candles in remembrance of the 6 million Jews and the other millions of people who were the victims of the Holocaust. It again brings stark the impact that it has had on all of us. I'd also like to thank all our special guests who came this evening, the members of Parliament, leaders, members of the Consular Corps, leaders of other faith and ethnic communities. Again, showing the importance that the rest of the community places and how we can how important it is that we give lessons, the rest of the community learns the lessons of the Holocaust and the other genocides which have occurred since that. And of course, also like to thank the people who organised this evening, our partner for this evening, the Jewish Holocaust Centre, and those who devoted their time to organising it, in particular Danielle, Kamien and Evelyn Portek from the Jewish Holocaust Centre and Hilary MacMahon from the JCCV. And thank you all for attending this important event. As the years separate us from the Holocaust, and as few of us have the opportunity to hear firsthand the stories of those who survived, we need to remember, through education, through evenings such as this, so that it will not be repeated again.